hit teams.
The United States Army, of course, has its contingency plans for putting down civil disturbance in the United States. They had these programs in the 1960s called Cable Splicer and Garden Plot for entering onto the scene in the event of civil disturbance in the United States. These activities continued on into the 1980s, but the main agency that became involved on the civilian side was FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
The FEMA has created a great deal of paranoia, probably for very good reason. Their whole reason for existence is to take control and keep things going in time of a crisis of, earthquake or military crisis. In the instance of a military or political crisis, we don't know what extremes they're willing to go to. They've drawn up their martial law plans.
One of the things that grew out of the military contingency planning, such as Cable Splicer and Garden Plot, was the military assistance to the police forces in organizing these and training these SWAT squads. So these are, in fact, outright militarized police units, even though they are civilian. And the United States military, the Army particularly, had much to do with the establishment of these units through the 1960s and into the 70s. Now, I think all the way across the country there are SWAT units everywhere. And they started out in places like Chicago, I believe, and Los Angeles. But they were done with the help of the U.S. military.
Well, Rex 84 was a plan to collect dissidents around the country who might be involved in violent activity and throw them basically in detainment camps. Some people call them concentration camps.
They had, I believe, something like 17 military installations selected in the United States, where they would house up to, I believe, something like 150,000 or 250,000 people in the event that the streets turned to chaos if Reagan had invaded Central America in the early 1980s.
So despite what the director of the FBI may be saying currently, you can assume that they're still conducting covert operations.
They were going to round up every dissident and every person who took to the street, plus a lot of foreigners, at the same time, because they did not want to have the situation develop as it had against Johnson and Nixon over the Vietnam War. So in the early 80s, Reagan said all he had to, it was all prepared, the statement declaring martial law, suspending the Constitution, and then they could go out and take everybody over to these military reservations, the equivalent of concentration camps, and just hold them there until what he wanted to do was done.
The government is definitely shifting intelligence resources to the private sector. And one of the reasons for this is to escape public scrutiny under a law such as the Freedom of Information Act. Freedom of Information Act only applies to government agencies.
You have to imagine technology 20, 30 years in advance of what we're using today. All that is classified, and it's classified for a very good reason, because it's being put to criminal uses.
Bugging and interception of private communication, the disappearance of privacy, you might say. What's going on now is that there are large private corporate databases accumulated that accumulate information on individuals, track their activities, track their economic activities. These corporations would call themselves credit corporations or whatever, but they're essentially intelligence operations.
Please listen, my brother and my sister too. Although these lines may not apply to you, we need less killing, less killing, more chilling. We can reach the pinnacle if our mind is willing. Less drinking, more thinking. What the hell is shocking? Our minds, body, spirits, and our hell is shocking. I mean to suggest, get the hell is rest, and we can live a little better. I do profess. You see the stogie leads to the bottle, bottle to the joint. It's a domino effect. If you get my point, the joint to the coke to the dope, and you know what? The wake up either dead or broke.
If the ultimate weapon is a bigger subsidy, we will use it. It is worth it. It's worth $50 million this year if that's what it costs to buy a $3 million crop, if it'll do the job. Now, it may be there'll be social problems and the political problems and the rest, and their embarrassment that won't do the job. My guess is that $50 million wouldn't do it, but it is worth it to this country If that will do the job, pay $50 million.
How it is that the United States, with all its military services, the Coast Guard, the CIA, the FBI, the DEA, and cooperating agencies, including local police departments, how they are not able to suppress the drug trade in the United States, how they cannot seal the borders and stop these shipments coming in, and then the whole distribution system.
The nature of the drug use and availability of drugs began to change as the Vietnam War went bad. Specifically, there was a shift from the availability of relatively innocuous drugs like marijuana and hashish on the street to those drugs becoming relatively scarce due to federal drug programs, and they're appearing instead a large quantity of very pure, very cheap heroin.
DEA, FBI, CIA, military, they're all into this international narcotics trafficking. So it doesn't mean that any particular target is only the area of one intelligence agency, because there are all kinds of interagency working groups in which they coordinate their activities directed toward a single target.
The drug trade always supports the government's internal political agenda. It has never not supported the government's internal political agenda. For an example, the phenomenon we saw with the Nicaraguan situation, which we call the Iran-Contra affair, Iran had less to do with the Iran-Contra affair, in our opinion, than Colombia, because it was the Colombian drug pushers which opened up avenues for finance that the United States government could not get legally from the Congress.
Some of the Hmong tribespeople were involved in the production of poppies, and under the CIA, that production greatly increased, and the revenues from the sale of those drugs, which were flown out by CIA proprietary airlines, were used to further finance covert operations by the CIA.
So what the United States government did was to get the ready cash through Elliott Abrams that allowed drugs, cocaine, to come into these poor communities all over the country as a means to then serve the secondary agenda, which is to sedate and control and criminalize as many of those black and Latin people that they can.
One of the effects is to take totally out of the political picture a whole generation or two of young black males who either get involved in the drug trade and end up in prison, or who get involved in consumption and do not get involved in politics.
It's the state that builds the archipelago of prisons. It's the state that invents a rhetoric of 3 strikes and you're out. It's the state that invents a vocabulary that is soaked in crime, which is meant to describe the lives of young people, adolescents, basically.
I've spent 19 years in prison in the United States for my political beliefs. You were the symbol that helped sustain me and other African-American political prisoners. I say to you, brother, we love you and we will not give up the fight. We will not give up the fight. We will not give up the fight. We will not give up the fight.
I think we've had political prisoners in the United States for a very long time. On an official level, they would not admit this.
Of course there are political prisoners in the United States, even if the U.S. government will never admit to them. Political prisoners are the heartbeat of the struggle, reminders of what the struggle is really about. They have been behind the wall now 15, 20, and going on 25 years. They must not be forgotten.